All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for today's Spring into Health event. My name is Haven Spanier, and I'm the Senior Director of Programming at the U of SC Alumni Association, and it's my pleasure to get to introduce our hosts today. Before we get started, just a few reminders. If you all have questions throughout today's event, we definitely want to hear them. So you can type those either into the chat or the Q&A. If you aren't super familiar with Zoom, there should be a panel across the bottom of your screen. Both the chat and the Q&A buttons are down there, so you can type in your questions throughout, and we will get to those after the presentation today. I would also like to thank Prisma Health for making today's event possible. But without further ado, it's my honor to welcome our host today. Simon Hudson is a tourism professor at the University of South Carolina, now part-time and living in Portugal, and is a consultant for the travel industry worldwide. He's written 10 books, including the recently published COVID-19 and Travel, and over 100 research articles and book chapters. With an eclectic background in the ski industry, retail, and academia, Simon is a font of international experience and comprehensive business information. His cosmopolitan and creative ideas have been influenced by award-winning work at the University of Calgary and the University of Brighton, as well as visiting academic positions he has had in Austria, Switzerland, Spain, Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia. Simon has also taught 3 times on Semester at Sea, a floating university that circumnavigates the world. Hoping we get to hear more about that too. But thank you so much, Simon, for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that is working okay. Is that good? I presume it's good. Just tell me if it's not.
Good.
I don't know who's going to tell me, but yeah, tell me if it's not. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. And thanks for joining. Yes, I'm in Portugal. It's 4:00 in the afternoon. Beautiful day. Just been down on the beach. Unfortunately, we're in lockdown until next Monday, I think it is. So, but plenty to do, including this. So without further ado, I'll continue. Like Haven said, one of the latest books I've written is on COVID-19 and travel. So I've been looking at this for quite a while. Although the book came out in August last year, I've been working on the topic ever since. And what I'm doing right now, I'm working on a project for the United Nations looking at recovery and how destinations around the world have dealt with COVID-19 from a tourism point of view and hospitality, and how they're recovering. And I'll refer to some of those examples as I go through. I'm also working on a project for the Department of Commerce, similar in terms of looking at industry adapting and the future, but focus more on South Carolina and the US. So, and again, I'll refer to that as I go through. What I plan to do to cover this afternoon, look at the impacts that COVID-19 has had on tourism and hospitality, how the industry has responded to the pandemic, and then some key insights. So what's coming out of all the research that I've been doing for the last year or so, and then we'll take a look into the future. What's the future going to look like for our sector? Yes, a lot has happened in a year. When you look at the impacts, I mean, I think about a year or so today, I was in some peaks in Canada skiing, having a fun time, looking forward to another month's spring skiing. And then the pandemic hit, and I can remember the governor of Colorado getting up one morning on Saturday morning. I can remember it because it impacted us, but he had a report on his desk that showed that COVID rates, infection rates were 20 to 30 times higher in ski resorts than anywhere else. And so he said, we got to shut down. And immediately there was a domino effect. Resorts all over the world just closed. And, you know, we moved into lockdown, as you know, and what occurred to me very early on, and the reason I decided to write the book, was that travel was going to play a critical role, you know, very closely linked to this virus, not because it was going to have the virus going to have an impact on travel, but travel was causing the spread of this virus. You know, one of the first case studies I wrote in the book was about the Diamond Princess. And the cruise ship, that one 80-year-old passenger got sick, and it ended up with 712 infected passengers, 7 deaths, and infections all over the world. And when we look back on this a year later, it was interesting. I was just reading about Japan the other day, how their virologists went on board back in February last year and immediately said, hey, this thing's traveling through the air. We need to tell our citizens to wear masks, to social distance, to avoid close areas. And they were on this very, very early on. And we went, ironically, at this time, I just finished, as Haven mentioned, I've taught on semester at sea 3 times, and I just finished a voyage that went around the world. And, one of the subjects I was talking about was over-tourism. At the time, we were suffering, a lot of destinations were suffering from over-tourism, and residents were complaining there were too many tourists. The tourism experience was deteriorating. But suddenly we moved from that to a situation of under-tourism, just no tourism whatsoever. And we hadn't seen anything like this. It really was, this word unprecedented has been used a lot of times, but we really had seen nothing like this, and may never again. And 2020 ended up being a disastrous year for the tourism industry. I think international tourists fell about 74% in total. Over 100 million people have lost their jobs, and when it was all over the world. It wasn't just the developing world. Everywhere, everybody suffered. In the US, tourism dropped by half, and as it did in South Carolina, I think in the end in 2020, tourism income was down from about 24 billion to 12 billion, and similarly, about 50% of employees in the industry lost their jobs. And there were some silver linings. National park income did increase by about 13%. And some of the golf courses saw an increase in revenue, but generally, hotel occupancy was down about 40%, 50%. Not as bad as some states. Obviously places like Hawaii suffered, and we were a little better than the national average. But generally, our tourism was about 50% down, and still is suffering. Still is about 15% down 2019 levels, but it will come back. It wasn't just the economic impacts that we know about. There's been huge social impacts, again, that are just coming out, but we're all aware of it. We all have changed, our habits and the way we work. And of course, that's going to influence travel, business travel, for example. I can't see that coming back for some time, not just because we become used to using this type of technology, but I think with companies are going to start to say, well, can we afford to send people around the world for conferences? So I think social impacts are going to have an impact on our travel as well, health and well-being, etc. And there's also been environmental impacts. We saw images of places around the world, like the reefs in Australia taking a rest, and yes, it was ecosystems have had time to breathe. The problem with that, though, is that a lot of destinations that rely on tourism just have no income to come in to preserve the very destinations that we're going to see. The reefs, Tubatara Reefs in National Park in Philippines, for example, tourism revenues make up half of the conservation budget. So the money just dried up. There was no money coming in. In Africa, we saw a sharp rise in poaching of gorillas. In Thailand, where elephants were facing starvation. There were so many examples where conservation money just dried up. And tourism, was fueling that and just completely stopped. So how did the industry respond? Obviously we know all about the impacts now, and it's still continuing. How did the industry respond to the pandemic? Obviously, it varied around the world. Generally, I would say most countries did support their tourism and hospitality sectors. Most of them responded quite quickly as well. This diagram here was an international study, saying that most of the responses were either fiscal and monetary policies, jobs and training policies, or restarting tourism. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go forward. And of course, they were less because most destinations have only just started to restart. Some haven't at all. So most of the funding went into fiscal and monetary and protecting jobs. And as I say, it did vary around the world. We see the support was perhaps better in Asia and Pacific and the Americas, less so in Africa and the Middle East. From an industry point of view, one thing that's come out of this is that what I call COVID adaptability, but the ability to adapt, to be flexible, to respond quickly, and to completely pivot sometimes has been absolutely critical. I think it was very clear early on that business wasn't coming back to normal. Were clear to me anyway, and to survive, it really has been a matter of survival. Survive, you had to adapt, and we're seeing now some great examples of this, what I call COVID adaptability. An early one was a ferry operator in the southern England who, his business dried up, no tourists, but he realized there was a big demand from people wanting to see all the cruise ships that were anchored out to sea because they had nowhere to go. The cruisers have got to go somewhere. It costs them thousands and thousands of dollars to anchor in a port. So a lot of them were dotted out on the south coast of England. And so he ran tours of the cruise ships and did very, very well. There was a couple of, again, back in the UK, there were a couple of actors that set up, all the theatres were closed, set up a business to take productions to the doorstep. So if you want to see the favorite part of your favorite play, Les Miserables, whatever it was, they would take it to your doorstep. Some entrepreneurs, business musicians said, hey, I'm going to change. Yes, we can't have crowds, but how about having a drive-in? And this is a singer in Denmark, Mats Langer, who set up the first drive-in music festival. In Japan, there was a couple of entrepreneurs set up a virtual bar service. In Japan, there is izakaya, they call it. It's a kind of a boisterous pub where everybody goes to after work, and of course those are all closed. So what these entrepreneurs did, they set up this Ikitsuke virtual bar service where you could order your appetizers from one of these bars and then arrange to meet your friends at a virtual bar. They'd have the same appetizers all delivered. You'd all have the same drinks and get together at the same time every night. And it's proved to be very successful. Hotels have had to pivot. Marriott, other companies have recognized the need for hotel day occupancy. Not everybody was happy working from home, and a lot of us have got a little bit bored with it. So they were renting out rooms in the day for people wanting to get away and work, and that continues to be the case in a lot of countries. Being very popular in Japan, actually. Airlines had to adapt. Obviously, they weren't flying, and so some of them said, "Well, let's fly to nowhere." And in Thailand and Australia and other parts of the world, I think India, there were flights to nowhere. That you could either get on a plane and go nowhere, or it might be a flight to within your own country, flying over heritage sites. But whatever, these kind of ideas did very well. But for many, many destinations, it was having to refocus perhaps and refocus on domestic tourism as we started to come out of lockdown in many parts of the world. We couldn't travel internationally, but we could travel domestically. So a lot of destinations, this is just one example, California, calling all Californians, but the need to focus and kickstart the industry focusing on domestic tourism. In New Zealand, New Zealand's been held up as a great example of controlling the virus, but New Zealand, 20% of their exports is tourism, and that just completely stopped. Over $100 million a day is normally spent in New Zealand by tourists, and that money wasn't coming in. So they had to persuade their own residents to do something, to visit places like, well, I don't know if you can guess, but this is the most popular attraction in New Zealand, probably one of the most popular attractions in the world, receives about 700,000 visitors a day, and it's Hobbiton, famous from the films. I'm a big fan of movie tourism, but and they weren't receiving tourists, so they had to reach out and say, hey, to the Kiwis, hey, come and visit. And in the end, they had 70,000 visitors 2020, which was pretty good considering they normally get very few domestic tourists, but everyone was having to reach out for those domestic tourists. China recovered very quickly because of the domestic market and continues to do well. India as well. In fact, India, those destinations that are not so reliant on international tourism, about over 80% of India's tourism is domestic tourism. So they've managed to recover quite well by persuading their people to visit different parts of India with various incentives. A lot of countries had to incentivize their citizens to go out and travel. It wasn't always successful. You look at, this is Bali, where normally their hotel occupancy is 80-90%. They need 40% occupancy just to make a profit. when they opened up to domestic tourism, it was about 5–10%. So they didn't receive much success. The Indonesian weren't traveling. Same in the Philippines. And I think when I look at this, a lot of it was trust in the governments. It wasn't, people were very cautious in those countries about traveling. They weren't sure about their safety. Philippines, for example, had to, in the end, they were insisting on COVID tests for traveling. They had to pay half of those tests for the people just to incentivize to travel. But a lot of it was about trust in governments. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And other countries, they just didn't have domestic tourists. This is Laos in Southeast Asia. They rely a lot on, mostly on international tourists from China, Thailand, Vietnam, all who were in lockdown, borders were closed. So they had no domestic tourists to fill that void. So for them, there was just no business at all. Another thing during this pandemic, the industry early on, or I think we all did, recognize that, and it's been said a lot together. This is where I was actually in Canmore in Alberta for most of lockdown, the first lockdown anyway. And this phrase, "we are in this together," has been used a lot. But I think we realized this was a collaboration. And we hear this a lot now when the vaccine's being talked about, particularly in Europe where I am. Hey, until we all get out of it, until we've all had the vaccine, the industry, we're not going to come back. We're not going to recover as normal. And one of the good things that came out of this pandemic for me was this, and this word was used a lot in Canada, caremongering, but people looking after each other, getting together to create, this was a virtual platform, My Travel Pledge, that was created by two entrepreneurs in Spain, Andalusia, who said, hey, how about offering our accommodation, our beds that are empty, to health workers and people that are on the front line when they're on the vacation or after the pandemic or after lockdown. And they invited accommodation providers all over the world to provide free accommodation for health workers. And it was an incredibly successful campaign. And that continues to carry on. Just on this, I went down for a takeaway coffee, because we're allowed to have takeaway coffees at the moment, to a bar down called Habana down where I am in the Algarve in Portugal. And every week they offer a free meal for people in need. And so that caremongering continues. And I think from an industry point of view, it's very powerful, because we will remember those things when the pandemic is over. In terms of collaboration, I think what we're going to see in the future is countries getting together to create zones of exclusivity, and they already have, but travel bubbles, it's been called, and New Zealand or Australia are again talking about a travel bubble. And I think that's how we're going to start getting tourism started again. So again, it's a need to collaborate. Another thing that's occurred, to me during the pandemic is communication is absolutely critical. The tendency during a crisis is to cut communication, cut advertising. Travel advertising was cut 93% last April, over the year. And it's the wrong time to cut your communication. You need to be out there talking to consumers, talking to stakeholders, employees. And, some countries did really well. There were some great campaigns that came out of the pandemic. Till Then, Stay Safe in Greece. Can't Skip Hope was the Portugal one. We had a With Love from Oz campaign, which I thought was a very emotional, powerful campaign. And then another example, the Faroe Islands, which was a virtual campaign where you could dictate where you moved around in the Faroe Islands with cameras on certain people who were traveling around. But they were all different ways of connecting with people while people couldn't visit in person. And, I think during this time, social media became more important than ever. It was already increasing as a valuable communication tool. But I think destinations during this pandemic realized that, hey, we can do a lot with it. An example was Zermatt in Switzerland, that portrayed images of countries' flags on the Matterhorn every day for a month during the pandemic. And they had, I think 7 million people saw these images, and it had tremendous publicity all over the world. And so many destinations like Visit Britain here had virtual campaigns whilst people couldn't visit, but where you could visit virtually different attractions, just to keep people engaged, keep the destination top of mind until visitors could come. And I think this is going to prove to be very popular. So those were the kind of things that were going on or have been for the last 12 months or so. But what are the outcomes? What are the key insights? For me, researching this topic for a year or so, what are we learning? What can we take away from this for the future? I think the key highlight for me is that, and again, this was something I was saying before the pandemic, but there is an overdependence on tourism in many destinations. So many parts, particularly in the developing world, so many parts of the world were relying on tourism as their number one economic engine. And tourism is very vulnerable to uncontrollable events, with tsunamis. It's not just pandemics, tsunamis, exchange rates, very vulnerable. And it's a very fragile industry. The margins are very tight. So I think we've realized, many countries have this overdependence. When you look at countries here, this is country rankings in terms of dependence. Aruba have 86% of their GDP is dependent on tourism. And I've done quite a bit of work in Aruba. I'm teaching a course there right now on entrepreneurship. And, I've been saying for a long time that these types of destinations need to diversify. They need other ways of bringing in income. You can't rely on just one industry, and particularly in Aruba, where I think 90% of their tourism is dependent on Americans coming. So you only even have one target market. So I think destinations have realized, hey, we're over dependent. We need to diversify, and we're a fragile industry. And at the same time, I mentioned about over tourism earlier on in the presentation, but I think some have realized that this is time to press the pause button and rethink tourism. This is Venice, but Venice, Barcelona, Paris, there were so many destinations. Dubrovnik, I was with students in Dubrovnik on semester at sea 18 months ago, and they were desperately worried about the over tourism in their city. And of course, it's there's no tourism now, but this is a time to rethink and re-strategize and say, well, do we want to be different? As we come out of this pandemic, do we want a different type of tourism? How can we be more sustainable? And I'm hoping, again, it's a hope, we may go back to our bad habits, but I'm hoping that this rethinking and sustainability is going to be a big part of strategies as destinations move forward with tourism. And places like Bali have realized that, that it's not all about tourism. A lot of the employees there who have been in tourism for years have gone back to agriculture, and they may never come back to tourism. Tourism, they might say, hey, I'm going to stay, this is more sustainable. I'm going to stay in agriculture, or whether they move into technology or another business. But I think it's people, not just industry, the employers have realized maybe this is a kind of fragile industry. We need to diversify. And, again, something was a bit of a trend even before the pandemic, where tourism destinations were beginning to talk about place branding as opposed to destination advertising and destination branding. We did a project when I was working in as I'm based in Portugal now, but when I was working in South Carolina, we did a project down in Bluffton. And Bluffton wanted a destination branding campaign, but they said, we want this more about a place brand. We want to brand Bluffton as a place to live, to work, to play. And I think, as far as I know, the campaign has been very successful, but we're seeing more and more destinations realize that, hey, we're more about tourism. We want people to come here, but we can attract talent. New Zealand's latest campaign, this is a message from New Zealand. It's all about everything New Zealand, every bit. It's all about their economy. It's all about attracting people to live, to work, to play. And what we've seen as an outcome here, the pandemic is an increasing number of destinations, Cambodia, Costa Rica, Barbados, Canary Islands, attracting people to live, work, and play. And one of my favorites was Hawaii's Movers and Shakers campaign, where they actually targeted people who could help them with problems that have come out of the pandemic. So people that could actually get into communities. So it wasn't just the average digital nomad, but they wanted people who could really help their island and their state with problems that are associated with COVID. And I quite like this campaign, and I hope they continue with that one. But number of destinations realizing that, hey, we need more than tourism. Another thing I think, a highlight that's come out of the research I'm doing, is that and again, you could say, well, this is obvious, but strong leadership and support for the industry is essential. And this has got to come from the top. But when you look around, you look at leadership over the last 12 months, and interesting, a lot of it is a lot of the key leaders have been female leaders or the successful leaders, but they've tended to prioritize health, and again, we've had this debate, and this diagram here was a study done of health and wealth, and the idea that you either had to choose health or wealth. It wasn't about that. I think there was you could choose both. And some countries have done incredibly well. Vietnam was at the top of this list, and this study, but Taiwan and New Zealand and Iceland, there's a number of destinations that have done really well with this, controlling COVID-19, but also supporting the industry so that it's stronger coming back. And it's all about leadership. It's all about trust in your leaders. And I think an outcome of this is that from a destination point of view, tourism and hospitality point of view, these countries will benefit in the long run. And I've been saying this for some time, but I think there'll be a halo effect. We'll look back at those destinations, Japan and Taiwan and New Zealand, and say, hey, these places have dealt well. I trust these places. I'm going to travel there. And I think with those destinations, yes, they may have really suffered in the short term by cutting off and really focusing on controlling the virus. But I think in the long term, from a tourism destination point of view, they will benefit. But we will see. That's just my theory. Another key outcome highlight of studying this the pandemic and its impact on the industry is there really has been an acceleration in the adoption of new technology. Technology was already starting to have a big influence on our industry, and it was something we talk about in classes. But I think this pandemic, more than ever, has really accelerated the adoption of new technology. This is just an example. One of the case studies I wrote was on Bhutan in Southeast Asia, which I knew very little about. And then Bhutan has an amazing policy on attracting high yield international tourists. You have to spend like $2,500–3,000 every time you go there, otherwise you can't visit. But their visitor entry permit process was very cumbersome. It was very difficult. So they've used this pandemic to upgrade the virtual system and the platform so that people, it's a lot easier now to get a visa. So they've used technology, advanced technology, used the time to advance technology. And we've seen an increasing number of destinations and industry players in hospitality adopt new technology. I mentioned virtual reality, and there's a big debate on whether or not virtual reality will take over from tourism visiting in the holodeck in Star Trek, for example. I don't think so. I think, but at the same time, I think it will be used more and more as a tool to attract tourists, to showcase destinations and attractions. And we as I say, we've seen a lot of that in the last 6–12 months or so. I think another a highlight or an insight has been that destinations have started to rethink target markets. I think, many destinations, and South Carolina is just as guilty as this, have targeted the same tourists for so many years. South Carolina, for example, goes after certain international markets, whether it's the Brits or the Germans. I think this pandemic has made destinations realize, well, maybe we need to look at different target markets. I think initially, there's a theory that there's a crisis-resistant tourist out there, younger, more adventurous, risk-taking tourists. And yeah, maybe in the short term, those will be your target markets, your younger, more crisis-resistant tourists. Or maybe, as this article in the New York Times was saying, it'll be the people who've had the vaccine. They're the ones that are going to travel first. I'm not so sure. We'll talk about the travel in a minute. But I think many destinations have realized that they may need to reevaluate and change target markets. Good example is the Maldives. The Maldives opened up very early to tourism compared to the rest of the world back in July, August, where they were the first destination to insist on a test when you come through to the islands. And they realized that the Chinese weren't coming back. The Chinese government weren't allowing their people to travel. So they've targeted the Indian tourists and done very well. And they've reopened, and they're doing very well in the tourism. And in fact, they're one of the first destinations to offer vaccine, or planning to offer vaccine tourism. And I'll mention that in a little bit. So what about the future? What might the future look like for the tourism and hospitality sector? I've been giving this a lot of thought, like this snow monkey in Japan and chewing my nails at the same time. And I think again, I've been saying this for a long time, but most experts will agree we're in for a long snow bumpy recovery. You know, we kind of get excited about things for a while. Certainly in Europe, oh, it's the vaccine, we can travel, we're going to be fine, and then we get hit in the, you know, something, oh, what about the variants, and we can't do this, can't do that. It's going to be a slow bumpy recovery, and I think, you know, most people realize now we're not going to come back to a full recovery. 2019 levels won't come back till 2023, 2024 in some sectors. As I mentioned, I think technology will define the future. You know, I always give the example of Caribbean cruises who introduced Royal Caribbean introduced these bionic bar robots, you know, about 5-6 years ago, but pretty much as a gimmick. These robots would make the drinks on the ship and stir, you know, they could do 1,000 different drinks a day, and you'd order on your QR code and this, that, whatever. They were so popular that they rolled them out on all the ships. And as I say, this was pre-pandemic. So I think we're going to see a lot more, because we're moving into a low touch economy. Technology will define the future. And you know, my wife Louise has avoided having a cell phone all her life. I think she and Elton John are the only ones left, but I think there'll come a time when she will need it. You know, I hear in Australia you have to have a phone when you check in now to restaurants and bars, and because of the track and trace, etc. You know, and we have technology used all over the place here. We've got drones patrolling beaches. We've got you know, webcams, we've got temperature controls. I think technology certainly would define the future of travel. And you know, we're hearing a lot more about health passports, digital passports. They're coming in. I don't think we can avoid it. And I think, you know, there's an argument about vaccine passports being discriminatory, but I think for a lot of businesses, it's the only way they can get back it's the only way we can get started again. For a lot of countries, we can get tourism going again. So, you know, and to be honest, when I've traveled before, I've traveled on semester at sea 3 times, and I've had to have a yellow fever jab every time I traveled, and you think nothing of it. So I think it will become common. We'll accept that, well, we need this passport. And I think, you know, again, instant testing, I think the technology is there for instant testing, and hopefully free instant testing will allow travel, will allow us to come out of travel internationally once again. And as I say, there are some countries now sort of mooting the fact that, well, come to us and have a vaccine on the way in, and the second one on the way out. The Maldives and in the Middle East, there's places that are already doing this, obviously for a price. And I think, you know, for those destinations, there are some, you know, the Olympic Games in Japan has been in the news at the moment, but I think destinations reliant on large events will have to wait a lot longer for the curtains to open. I think, and it's not just about social distancing, and it's more about the economy getting back on track, and I think people feeling safe, feeling secure, traveling, you know, going to big festivals. And it will come back, but I think it'll take a lot longer to come back. I think another key aspect, and again, that's come out of doing these case studies around the world, is destinations, countries have realized that they're going to need new skills coming out of this pandemic. We're going to need to retrain and upskill our people. You know, this example here, Trafalgar have employed what they call well-being directors who will travel on every tour they go. But I think even down to, you know, re-educating our students, you know, we need to, I think there's got to be a lot more emphasis on crisis management, a lot more emphasis on soft skills, which we already knew before, on customer service, health and safety, entrepreneurship, innovation. But the key one, I think, again, going back to adaptability, we need to be, our employees need to be adaptable, flexible, ready to, you know, multi-skilled, as it were. So I think, you know, we're going to have to go back to the drawing room and train and upskill employees. What about the traveller finally? What the future traveller is going to look like? I think cautious, of course. Studies are already showing that people will travel. There is a lot of pent up demand, definitely, and a lot of us already are travelling domestically. But people are going to be cautious. I think there's only a certain percentage that are going to go straight back in. People are very concerned about safe health and safety. Increasing number of destinations are introducing sort of health certificates, and clean and safe is the one we have down here in Portugal. But consumers are going to be looking to be reassured that health and safety you have that as your priority. And those hotels and restaurants and destinations that have health and safety as a priority will succeed. This one in the picture here is one that a hotel in Aruba that's always been an innovator, Bakuti and Tara Resort, but they were one of the first to introduce new health and safety protocols, and their hotel rooms are as clean as a hospital operating room. And they were one of the first to say to introduce new protocols, one of the first to have instant or testing where you could go and have a test in the morning and have the results delivered by lunchtime. And of course, naturally, their occupancy has been higher than others. But I think for everybody in the industry, you have to prioritize on health and safety. That's what the future travelers going to be looking for. Health and wellness tourism was, it was already growing before the pandemic, but I think it's going to really take off. And again, you need to emphasize that throughout whatever business you're in. And I think also destinations. I think Japan's been in the news a lot during this pandemic for being prioritizing health and taking care of citizens. And as I say, they were wearing masks before we even knew what we were told to. And I think those kind of destinations are more likely to attract tourists than others once this pandemic is over. Travelers will also want to avoid crowds, and I think at the end that's obvious, but again, we've got used to open spaces, and I think, certain sectors, as I say, will recover quicker than others. Cruise sector will be slower to recover, but maybe the small, small group cruises will help the industry recover, like these ones in the Galapagos Islands that help restart cruises. But tourists to start with will want to avoid crowd. And I think, there is going to be a renewed focus on sustainability and ethical travel. I think as during lockdown, we have become more attuned, as it were, to nature. I mentioned earlier on that, national parks in South Carolina, I think, the revenue has gone up 30%. Everybody's been outside, maybe a renewed appreciation of what we have of nature. And I think this will trickle down into the type of tourism that we're looking for, which is a good thing. And I think so there will be a renewed focus on sustainable and ethical travel. Just finally, we've heard a lot about, oh my God, travel's going back to being really expensive just for the elite, as it was perhaps in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. I'm not so sure. I think, yes, there will be, after initial incentive, after initial low prices to get people traveling again, prices may increase because of the extra costs of lower capacity or increased health and safety regulations, etc. But I think alongside this, we're going to, as I say, technology is advancing so quickly that all the time we're finding cheaper ways to travel. And so I think, we're in 5 years, we'll be back to cheap travel for the masses, which, I think is great for all of us in terms of travel access. But it may be that in the short term, travel does increase in price, just as I say, because of the reasons I've just mentioned. I think what's clear though is that we're not going back to normal. It is going to be a new normal, and for the industry, we need to accept that fact. We need to adapt. We need to pivot. But for travelers, if we're thinking of traveling, it's not going to be. It's going to be a little bit different. When I talk to people traveling right now, I have British people come and going, or they're trying to from Portugal, and a lot of them say, "Oh my God, I'm not doing that again." It's got to be seamless. We've got to make it easier for people to travel, but it's also got to be safe for people. But travel will come back. The pandemic will fade. Harari, one of my favorite authors, Yuval Harari, says that when we look back in 1,000 years, this will just be a little blip in history. It's been a bit more than that certainly for the hospitality and tourism industry, but it will fade, and we will get back to a new normal at some point. So I'm going to finish off there. I think, yeah, taken about 40 minutes, which is about right. So I'm going to hand that back. I'll stop sharing my screen. And back to Haven. Is she still awake?
Yeah, that was wonderful. I will go ahead and kick off the Q&A portion. So if you all have questions, you can either pull up the Q&A or the chat and type those in. We want to hear all of your questions. First one on here is, when do you think the cruise ship industry will recover, and when will it be safe to cruise again?
I don't know. I mean, there's two questions there. It's safety and perceived safety, of course. And we're not going to travel until we perceive we're safe, and that might be different to the reality. But as I say, I finished a semester at sea at the end of 2019. Went around the world for 4 months. I finished in San Diego, I think, on the 24th of December, and I hadn't even heard about the virus, and it really did. The cruise industry got a lot of bad publicity early on for continuing, February, March, despite all the warnings, and so it was kind of it was a symbol really of the pandemic, and so it did suffer from an image point of view, and that might take it time to and the problem is, as you know, the way the cruise industry was going, it was all kind of getting bigger and more economical, and we had ships of 6,000-7,000 people. That's not going to be the immediate future. As I said, people want to avoid crowds, so I think the small cruise ships, I've got friends who are, well, mind you, they've just had it cancelled, but they're hoping to go on a cruise. I think it was Norway, Sweden this summer, and it's been put back again and again. But I think because of the Norwegians are saying they're not allowing people coming in, and I know the Canadians have said we don't want cruise ships coming in our waters, and so it's going to take time. When I look at yes, semester at sea is not a real cruise, but we lease a cruise ship. It operates like a cruise, and although I know they're hoping to operate in the fall of this year, I've applied for spring 23, and I think that'll be the first time that'll be a normal, as I say, normal cruise. It still won't be normal. But so in answer to your question, maybe 2023, and I'm hoping, because as I say, I'd like to do it again, but it's going to be slower than other sectors to come back. Because of operational reasons, and also because, as I say, I think their image has been tarnished somewhat. But there's a lot of loyal cruisers out there I know who are desperate to get back cruising, and so they'll go as soon as they can. But I think it'll be slower than other sectors.
Thank you. All right, next one, and they do say, thank you for an interesting and informative session. Do you think vaccine passports may be used for summer vacations? I think they will. As I say, I think it'll become, there's a lot of debate around vaccine passports as being, is it ethical? It's discriminatory. But I think for a lot of, you look at, some of these, I mean, a lot of the examples I gave, countries who've really locked down quickly and control the virus. Vietnam. Vietnam's got 126 million people. They're on the border of China. They've recorded one death. They've done an amazing job controlling the coronavirus, but a huge sacrifice. They had a growing tourism industry, and they're desperate to get international visitors coming back in. But their people themselves are saying, well, we're worried, we're concerned. The Japanese, the Japanese Olympics, I could have told you back in January that they weren't going to allow international travelers because the people themselves had said, we don't want visitors, we don't want spectators. We've done an incredible job controlling this virus, and so we're worried, we're concerned. So this will ease concern. So for countries to open up again, and which they need to and they want to for tourism, there will be some controls, and so they will introduce vaccine passports. And I think whether we like it or not, if we want to travel, we will have to, show either, and it may not be just, or it may not be a vaccine, it may be a test, but there may be requirements for tests, instant tests, regular. And I think
I'm surprised instant testing hasn't come in by now. I was saying a year ago that it wouldn't be long. I remember speaking on a webinar with uh, someone from LAX airport who said they had the technology and it was under $5 a test, the cost to them. I'm just surprised that it hasn't come in yet. But anyway, that's another debate. But I do think in the future, yes, there will be controls, and I think there have to be. And again, that might be to ease, the concerns of residents. Whatever the reason is, at least it will allow international travel, summer travel, kickstart travel. So yeah, I can't see us avoiding that. I know there's places that, you could fly to Costa Rica now from South Carolina, I believe, and you don't need a test, you don't need a vaccine. So there will be places that will welcome you without, but I think there will be controls.
Thank you. The next question, what advice do you have for hospitality students graduating soon and looking for employment in the industry, or for alumni whose employment may have been affected and are looking to get back into the industry?
That's a good question, because like if you were one of those people and you just listened to my talk, you might be shaking your head and think, oh dear, I've wasted 4 years. I can remember years and years ago, I'm showing my age here, but back in the late 80s, there was a major recession on in Europe, and I just got into this field, and no one was traveling, and because it was no disposable income, and everyone was just suffering. And I can remember a lot of people moving out into other sectors, and they went off to work for blue chip companies or technology companies, but then they came back in. And what I found was interesting was that all the big tour operator, companies like TUI, the biggest tour operator in the world, they actually preferred those employees because they had experience in other industries. They had experience, different types of experience dealing with different types of people, different industries, different operations, and they preferred those people that had varied backgrounds, experience. And as I said, in terms of retraining people, we do need in the future, we're going to need people multi-skills. So I think there's nothing wrong with going into a different sector. So it shouldn't be, oh my God, I can't get into travel hospitality, there's no jobs, what am I going to do? Go into something different. It may just be for 2 or 3 years, try something different. I think at the same time, like I say, that look at the trends, technology, health and wellness, this low touch economy, move into those type of sectors, focus on, something you obviously enjoy, you're passionate about, but focus on something like that, technology or whatever. Focus on entrepreneurship. More than ever in our sector, we need entrepreneurs. We need people looking for new ideas, new innovations, ways of adapting, ways of catering to the new consumer. And we often don't cover those kind of skills in the classroom. So maybe go out and start your own business, but gain different types of skills, because I think you're not going to be wasting your time. I don't know if that answered the question, but certainly I think in the future, our sector, employers are going to be looking for a different type of employee. It was ironic that back in 2019, the last big study I did when I was in South Carolina was on finding employees for our sector, because there was a desperate shortage of people going into hospitality and tourism, and that will come back. But at the time, one of the things we found was that employees were saying that our students didn't have good soft skills, and by that I mean looking someone in the eye, smiling at them, opening a conversation. It sounds like, well, everyone should be able to do that, but they weren't. And we actually started to have sessions where students would come up to us as professors or teachers and open a conversation, and we would grade them on it. I mean, it sounds ridiculous that we should have to do that with 22-year-olds, but the industry was saying that your students, they've been stuck in front of a screen too long. We need soft skills. So I think it's if I was to advise students going in or graduates going into industry now, retrain, reskill, look at those new skills that are needed. Don't be afraid of doing something different and coming back into this industry later on.
Definitely. Thank you. Next one, and you talked a lot about different businesses and countries adapting during COVID-19, but in your opinion, what countries or what businesses specifically do you think did the best job or were the most innovative in making those changes?
I'd say in general, from a country's point of view, Asia stands out. For various reasons, I think, looking back on it, and still now, but looking back on it, I think various reasons. Like I mentioned, there was a lot of trust. There was a very good, and I don't know if you're able to get it over there, but there was a very good BBC program on last night on Panorama, and it answered this very question for an hour. It wasn't focused on tourism, but it was who's done best here, and and they interviewed people in South Korea, in Sweden, in Taiwan, and whatever. And I remember the South Korea Prime Minister or President. I can't remember who he was, but one of the leaders was saying there it was all about trust in your governments, trust in your leadership, and those countries that were able to gain that trust. Like Janice Ardern in New Zealand, she was able to gain that trust very, very early on. So that whenever she introduced a policy, the people just said, yeah, we'll do it. Vietnam was the same. When the government said, look, we're locking down. You're all wearing a mask every day. You're doing this, you're doing that. People said, yeah, okay, we trust you. We know this is for our good in the long term. So there were certain countries, and even in the US, there were certain states, I think, that did a better job. And it was usually came from strong leadership. A lot of it was cultural as well. Of course, some cultures are more willing to say yes than others. So, this is yes. Other people say, well, this is my right. I think that also a lot of countries in Asia saw this coming. They experienced. I can remember being in Canada. The beginning of the ski season last year, before the pandemic hit, my two boys, they're both in Canada and they're 24 and 28. And they said to me, Dad, you've got to watch this Netflix movie called Pandemic. And I said, why? They said, oh, it's coming. I said, oh, shut up. Anyway, they made me watch it. And of course, when you watch that, it's all about and this was way before, well, not way before coronavirus, but it was made before coronavirus came along. It was all about the experience that the Asian countries had with previous viruses, and so they were ready. They were prepared. The Japanese were, and they would have a strong focus. The title of this presentation, Spring into Health. I did notice that those destinations that have always had a focus on health. Those countries have come out of this a lot quicker and a lot better. Japan, example, their obesity rate is 10 times lower than the obesity rate in the US. So of course, it's no surprise that they haven't, the people themselves haven't got so ill with the coronavirus. And so coming out of this, I think we're realizing that maybe, and that's why I mentioned health and wellness tourism, but I think all of us have realized we need to take care of ourselves a little bit better, more focus on health. So yeah, there have been that question on organizations. I think it depended. It wasn't, in terms of organizations that were more innovative, that had adapted it well. I don't think it was country specific. Yes, there are some countries like Israel that are culturally more innovative than others. I think it just depended on individual, from my research, it was individual organizations, and usually an individual person. I mentioned Bakuti and Tara in Aruba, this one hotel, but it's really because of the owner, Edward Beemans, who's always been very focused on sustainability. He was into sustainable tourism before we even knew what it was, and environmentally friendly rooms, and before I remember his gym was all powered by people cycling. This was 20 years ago, and everyone said he's mad. Now he has higher occupancy than any other hotel in Aruba and high room rates. But so it depended on the person. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about skills needed to succeed in this sector, you have to be innovative, you have to be flexible, you have to be forward thinking, always looking ahead, always looking at trends, what's coming next. The type of person I hope that's listening to this seminar is the type of person that wants to learn, wants to, hey, how do I get an edge? Because they'll come out of this talk maybe with one tiny little thing, but that one tiny little thing will perhaps give them an edge in this sector in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years' time.
Thank you. So as people are starting to get vaccinated and feeling a bit more comfortable with travel, where do you see the safest destinations to kind of start off on travel?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If I was to be thinking about traveling right now, well, I am. I'd be looking at. I would actually, and going back to what I was talking about, countries that have controlled the virus well, I'd be certainly looking at countries that have prioritized health, because if they prioritized health for their citizens, they're going to be looking after you as a traveler. You would hope. So I would be looking at destinations that are really, going all out to provide, certifications for their providers. I was just writing a case study this morning on Costa Rica. They have a certification. I mentioned one in Portugal for all but I'd be looking at those destinations and those providers. It might be just an individual hotel or an individual destination that have my health and safety as a priority. I'd also perhaps be looking at those, again, that have communicated throughout, that have kept a dialogue open, that haven't hidden away, that have explained what they've been doing, in terms of opening up and policies in place. I'd also, I'd be wary. I think we're going to see a lot more late booking, because I think travelers are going to be a bit more cautious. So many of us have had plans cancelled. I have, and have all the providers given their money back? Maybe not. I've got tons of vouchers to spend, but I may necessarily want them. But so I'd be careful about that again. And it goes back to, how has that provider behaved during this pandemic? Has it been in a responsible way, social responsible way, the destination? Look at insurance. Do I cover, I know a lot of destinations, if you go to Costa Rica, for example, they insist you have, Maldives, places insist you have Cambodia. You can travel to Cambodia today, but I think you have to put a $2,000 deposit down as an insurance if you happen to get ill. But, I would be looking to make sure that I was covered if something did go wrong. But and it's going to change. It changes. It's really dynamic right now. 1 minute a destination is safe, the next minute it's like here where Portugal was on the red zone for the UK. Now it's been taken off, and it confuses people. So it's very important to do your research and just take your time. Don't jump into booking anything. I say the number one thing for me would be look for a destination or an organization or a hotel that they have my health and safety as a number one priority. And I would pay a little bit more for that. And I think we're going to see that consumers are going to pay a little bit more for that personalized, customized touch. And we won't mind doing that, because health and safety has always been the number one motivator for travel, always, even before this pandemic. So as we come out of this, it's going to be the first thing we look for, I think. And again, it might depend on the type of travel you are. Obviously, there's some people that like to take risks and maybe just say, hey, I'm just going, and that's fine. It'll probably be safe. But most of us, I think, are going to be a lot more cautious.
All right, I think we have gotten through all of the questions, but thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us today, Simon. It's very fascinating. Thank you to everyone who logged on today. I know you had some great takeaways from this presentation. Thanks again to Prisma Health for making this event possible. But that is it for today's event. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again, Simon.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.